Hello, hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinars. I'm Chen Yus. I'm the director of the Center for Innovation and Precision Eye Health. Today we have a very special speakers, Dr. Yun Liu. Dr. Liu is a research scientist from Google. Over the years, he has been working with some very innovative AI approach for medical image analysis. And he has published several proof of concept papers and also landmark papers in high-impact journals. Although Dr. Liu is based at the Google headquarters in San Francisco, actually, he is a Singaporean. He completed his secondary school education here before relocating to the United States. Today, he's going to share with us his research work on using external eye photos to detect biomarker and disease. Yun, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Prof Cheng, for the introduction. Let me start my screen share. So before I kind of start on this, I'll just mention that this is work by a pretty large team of people, and it's work covering multiple manuscripts over the past few years. And so some of the detailed methodology here actually differs a bit from study to study, but I'm happy to talk about any details if folks are interested. Okay, so disclosures. Employee of Google, I own Google stock. Not a surprise based on my employer. And the premise for a lot of the work that we're discussing today stems from the fact there's been a lot of work looking at systemic biomarkers by predicting them from these fundus photographs. Some of the folks in the audience have worked on this yourselves, and a lot of the work is also by Prof Tianyin Wang and others in the department. So over time, people have shown that a lot of risk factors could be predicted from these fundus photos because it's a non-invasive view into the vasculature of the body, ranging from things like ocular diseases to anemia, diabetes, kidney disease, and more. So part of this inspired us to think about, what can we do beyond this? And one of the motivations for our work is that a lot of the work so far, the fundus photographs, are being taken by these fairly large machines, large from our perspective in terms of thinking about consumer devices. And so these machines are definitely not portable and also not available for most people unless you're in a clinical care setting. So what we then thought about was, hey, there's a smartphone and it's growing in terms of popularity over time and it's projected to reach more than 7 billion in a couple of years. Can we use smartphones to help? Another promising trend in the smartphone space is that the photo quality is increasing by quite a bit over time. So just comparing from DxO Mark, this image, from 2013, a smartphone from 2013, and over the next 6 years, the photo quality improved remarkably. And remember, this is not a smartphone, it fits in your pocket, and it's a really small sensor. So what can we do with that smartphone that is now one of the best cameras they can bring around, and it's right there in your pocket? So some folks have taken smartphones and paired with a lens, they're able to take photographs of the fundus using a smartphone. Now, this is really only possible if you have the skill and the practice to do so. Now, other people have taken smartphones and taken photos of the front of the eye, or what we call the external eye photo. And what's interesting is that we thought maybe we can detect something from these external eye photos, and some known stuff include pallor of the eye, and that can happen with severe anemia. So can machine learning help us do more than that? So rephrase, just using that same visual as before, our question we're trying to answer is, if we take a photo of the external eye, what can we predict from such photographs? And I'll emphasize a little bit that all of the results you'll see later on in this talk are using external eye photos taken using fundus cameras. So I'll jump straight to the results since the methods are a little bit different between different studies. But what we found was that using external eye photos, we were able to train the model to detect retinal diseases, so DR, as well as A1C. And in the plot, what we're comparing over here, so the blue over here is a baseline. In this case, the baseline includes a logistic regression model that is trained using age, sex, and years of diabetes. And so that model is making a prediction about whether this individual is likely to have DR or not. And those correlations exist within the data. The fact that it can do better than random is not surprising. What is surprising is that if we use the external eye model to do the same prediction, remember, this is a photo of the outside of the eye, not the retina. There's quite a bit of a delta between that baseline and the external eye photo. And in this case, the delta is about 5 to 10%, depending on which prediction you're looking at. And then what was surprising as well was that this kind of gap between the baseline model and the external eye fundus, external eye model actually also extended to things like kidney, so markers such as the ACR, EGFR, and more. Similarly, we saw results that were promising with blood count, including hemoglobin, white cells, platelets, as well as liver markers, albumin and AST, bone and mineral, and thyroid. So this is a pretty long list of stuff that seems to be possible to predict from the external eye. One thing I'll mention here, all of these results are external validation, meaning it was tested on a dataset completely distinct from the data that the model was used, that the model was trained on. So that's the AUC, and AUC is a measure that has some probabilistic interpretations that makes it very convenient, but sometimes it's a bit hard to understand what to do with AUCs. When you have AUCs that are in the range of 70%, as opposed to AUCs for some diagnostic applications that are in the 99+% range, what can you do with it? Well, what we did was to look into literature for what the corresponding AUCs are for things like mammography and cardiovascular risk screening, and it turns out that they are also not in the perfect AUC range, but also in a slightly more modest range. However, the purpose that they serve is not to diagnose a patient, but to help stratify patients and understand which patients may benefit from a biopsy or follow-up management, treatment, or diagnosis. So really the inspiration here is that you can use some of these tools as a precursor step before you figure out, to help figure out who's at high risk and may need to get testing done. That can be a really valuable purpose, even if the model isn't perfect yet. Now, to understand how the model might work for such a purpose, we have to look at a different metric than the AUC. And one way we have done this is using the positive predictive value, or the PPV. If you're unfamiliar with this metric, roughly what this is saying is, let's say you have 100 people that the model is predicting as positive. Of that 100, how many people are actually positive? So it's a measure of essentially what happens when the model predicts positive, how often it is actually right. What we did then here is to say, well, we don't know what the right cutoff should be. Let's try a range of cutoffs based on the percentage of patients that we want the model to predict positive, ranging from 0% all the way to 25% in this plot. So as you go from left to right, you're predicting more and more patients as positive. And because you're starting to include patients that the model thinks are actually not that high risk, the PPV tends to drop from left to right. Now, what's interesting is if we again compare the baseline model versus the external eye model, we see that the external eye model maintains a gap in the positive predictive value across the entire spectrum of PPVs for every single application that we were looking at. So this gap is where you might see an improvement in that if you're using the baseline model to prioritize 100 people, you get 55 right, versus using the fundus photo, using the external eye photo model, you get something like 15% improvement. So that's all based on performance metrics. The next thing we did was to think about what would be needed for this to work in practice. Now, we didn't have smartphone photos at that time, but if we think about the fundus photo, in principle, that is a DSLR with some better flash, lighting, patient stabilization, and also potentially some differences in image quality. It's harder to simulate what happens to the rest of the factors, but what we could do was to change the image resolution to make it worse and worse. So what we did here was to take the original image resolution, about 500 pixels across, and then started to downsample it by a half every single time. So what happens to the model when this downsampling is done? Well, it turns out that if you have this downsample images and you retrain a model on downsample images just so that it understands how to operate with low resolution photos, you can actually get models that actually do pretty well. And so this is comparing the baseline model, which doesn't have a notion of resolution, with the external eye model, which depends on the resolution of the input. And what we see is that it is better than a baseline up until actually a certain point, which varies based on the prediction. But essentially, even at as few as 75 pixels across, so this middle one over here, it is still doing better than a baseline. So that gives us a reassurance that you don't actually need extremely high quality photographs to do really well at this task. All you need is a photo that's showing some amount of detail in the eye. And so the next thing we did was to ask the question, well, how is this even possible? how can a model do a task that people don't know how to do? And so the first thing we did was something that didn't require any model retraining. What we did was to apply two kinds of saliency-based techniques. And a saliency-based technique, very briefly, what it does is when you input an image into the model, it runs the same model that we're studying, so the external eye model, and then it looks at the pixel values and it tries to understand which pixel values, if changed, make a large difference in the final prediction. So, and then we did that and repeated that for 100 different images, and then we averaged it. Now, when we did that, we generally saw that the heat maps seem to be highlighting something sensible. To understand to make sure that this is doing the right thing, we had a positive control experiment. We're using an external eye photo. We were trying to predict the presence of cataracts. So that's the bottom two over here. And what we saw was that the cataract saliency maps were highlighting very clearly the middle, so near where the pupil is. And that makes sense because this tells you whether there's any opacity in the pupil. And so, but the rest of this though was a little bit hard to interpret. A lot of them tended to be highlighting a little bit of what's in the pupil, also some of the vasculature around the eye, but it's kind of like a little bit fuzzy because there's a little bit of misalignment between different images. So it's a bit hard to interpret. And another thing that's a little bit unsatisfying is it doesn't explain how these things are affecting the prediction. There are also some other downsides and difficulties with interpreting saliency maps directly. And so we moved on to a few different other methods. One method that we tried here was we took the input image and we asked the question, well, if we take the image and then we started removing parts of the image, how does that affect the prediction? Every time we removed a certain section of the image, we actually retrained the model. So the model is robust and understands how to work with images of a certain section removed. We did this in two different ways. The first way is to have the center remain visible. And the second way is to start removing stuff from the center. And when we go from left to right, we remove the same number of pixels to keep the comparison fair. What we saw when we did that was that the performance decreases much more quickly when we remove stuff that is in the middle versus if you remove stuff that's near the periphery. What this indicates is that the middle is the part that is more important compared to the outside of the image. This pattern was seen for several predictions, but it basically held for every single prediction. So the next thing that we did was to ask the question, can we do a little bit better and try and remove certain anatomic segments of the image? And then what we did was we trained a iris and pupil segmentation model by asking people to label where the pupil is and where the iris is, and did that, and we trained a model that does this segmentation. Once we had that model, we could then ablate the images in a systematic way by saying, do we want images where only the pupil is visible, or only the iris is visible, or others? Now, when we look at the positive control experiment again, so that's the cataract line over here, the overall model's performance is this red bar, and we saw that once we removed anything else, if we removed everything, including the pupil, the performance got down very, very low. But once we only had the pupil, so this yellow one over here, just having a pupil, that's sufficient to get basically all of the performance down. So the positive control experiment here was working really well. But unfortunately, what we then saw was that for basically everything else, removing parts of the image does cause performance to suffer a little bit, but there wasn't, in general, anything where if you add back one part of the image, that part alone is fully sufficient for all of the performance. Hemoglobins may be the one that comes a little bit closer, but again, a lot of these there's a lot of performance drop when you remove certain sections of the image. So it was clear at this point that even techniques such as this wasn't quite enough to do what we wanted it to do. So we turned to a generative-based technique using GANs to try and understand what the model was doing. So in the GAN-based technique, I'll illustrate this with a cat versus dog classifier. What the model is trained to do is that, let's say there's an input image. Within the model, there's an encoder that then maps this image into a embedding layer. An embedding is basically a vector or numerical representation of what the image contains. And what's interesting in the StyleGAN methodology is that in this space, it turns out that these individual features tend to correlate with specific visual features. And when you have these features, what you can then do is to modify those features one by one, and that changes the final image that the generator is outputting. So in this example, let's say we were to modify some of these features, you see that this cat's ears, eyes, and then mouth are changing in specific ways based on what the value of the intermediate feature is. The classifier is used as part of this model because we can then take what the generated image is based on how it's changing. We can feed that into a classifier and see what the classifier thinks that new generated image, that prediction is. And so any feature that seems to be changing the classifier's output by quite a bit are features that we think the classifier are using to make its predictions. So we can then explore this in a very systematic way based on each of these individual features. Now, when we looked at this, here's what we saw for the positive control experiment. In this positive control experiment, we saw that the red reflex, so the central region over here, was becoming dimmer as we looked at this. And so this was consistent with the fact that when it's dimmer, that tends to happen when there's some opacity here, and then that opacity is obscuring some of the light that is passing through. So when we saw this, this was a good validation that this technique was doing the right thing. And then we moved on to look at another prediction. And in this case, this was looking at the A1C value. And so the model was predicting A1C. And a little bit surprisingly, we found that the margin over here was becoming lighter. We looked at the literature, and it turns out there's some evidence that meibomian gland disease is associated with diabetes. And one thing that might be happening is the model is picking up some kind of association with those glands that are changing. Now, some of the features that we found here were a little bit more counterintuitive. So here's one example. In this example, the model was predicting A1C, and what we saw was that this Arcus feature was actually appearing and being generated by the model. When we first saw this, our first reaction was, oh, great, age seems to be associated with A1C. That makes sense, because with age, patients with diabetes tend, on average, to have poorer blood sugar control, so that makes a lot of sense. So this was in some ways initially reassuring, and then we looked at the directionality of the effect, and we found that it's the opposite of what we were expecting. Thinking more deeply about a data set, we believe what's happening here is that there's a bit of a survivorship bias. So the data set that this was trained on was a DR screening population, and so when patients have poorer A1C control, they're more likely to have DR, and so they're more likely to be referred out of the program, which means in this particular data set, the directionality of this effect was such that if individuals were older, they tended to have better sugar control, not worse sugar control. Moving on, another example that we looked at was for predicting hemoglobin. And so in this particular case, what we saw was that there was a pallor that was happening around the eye. And this was reassuring because this is a known feature for as a hallmark of anemia. But what's interesting, though, is that we found additional features that we were not expecting. Here's one of them. In this feature, what we saw was that the eyeliner was appearing in this generated counterfactual image, and this was a bit surprising. But then we realized that the way that the model was being trained right now was it was predicting hemoglobin being less than a certain value. Now, both age and sex are correlated with hemoglobin values on average, and so what the model seemed to have learned was the fact that individuals of a certain age and sex tended to have eyeliner if they had lower hemoglobin, and this association with on average older women having eyeliner on their eyes was one that the model seemed to have learned. So the conclusion from kind of this series of work that we saw was that AI can detect biomarkers in external eye images with an accuracy surpassing that of a lot of baseline models. And this was an interesting observation, and we really wanted to understand how we can learn from it. But the performance itself, the fact that it generalizes low resolutions, does suggest that you don't need very high quality photos to actually get these performance. And so there's some promise over there to try and see if this is appropriate as a first-line pre-screening tool at home, meaning people maybe can take some photos of their eyes, see if they might be high risk, and perhaps then decide if they should go in person for a blood test or something else. When we applied a lot of these explainability techniques, step by step, we found that the model seems to be learning things that are important that's in the middle of the eye as opposed to the periphery. And that seemed to be promising. And then once we dived more deeply, we found that it was learning some features that were very reassuring, such as pallor for anemia, but also some features that were very counterintuitive, such as the ARCUS feature, which was we think a marker of the survivorship bias in the data set. And then finally, we also saw features that were learned that seem to be associated with demographics. And these probably are confounders that we don't want the model to be learning. So it really points to a way to do very careful debugging on the dataset. So with that, I conclude my talk slightly ahead of time, but I'm very happy to take any questions and talk through any of the results in more detail.
Thank you, Yun. So very interesting talk. Now we have a panel expert to help us further explore the idea, present, and also help us to discuss the potential applications. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Ray Najjar, and second is Dr. Tammy Zhong, and also Dr. Liu Danbao is also in the panelist. And Danbao is new to NUS, and he's a data scientist just joined us from MIT last week. And okay, to set the stage, could I ask each panelist to briefly share your thought and maybe raise some question? We start with Ray.
Yeah, happy to start. Yun, really amazing work. Can I was intrigued a little bit. So does it matter if you actually use both eyes for one patient instead of one eye for your results? Does it matter if you combine results from both eyes, given that you're looking at systemic health issues? Does it matter if one or two eyes are used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the answer is a bit complicated. I think we had two kinds of predictions. One was most of the predictions were systemic biomarkers, as you said. So these are stuff from blood tests and so forth. So we didn't expect that those things should change based on which eye you're looking at. And so for the most part, both during training and when we were using the model, we were averaging the predictions from the model. So I think we maybe saw some slight improvements when we did this averaging, but strictly speaking, it theoretically shouldn't matter too much. So I think the averaging was both doing a kind of like having an ensembling-like effect, as well as just really kind of like averaging out any differences between any signs in the eyes. The second type of prediction that we had, though, were regarding diabetic retinal diseases, so DR and DME. And so for those predictions, we were actually doing it at the eye level because the eyes may not differ in terms of the DR or DME status.
Thank you, Yun. Perhaps I'll ask the second question while we wait for more questions to come in from the audience. I'm just intrigued pertaining to the explainability approach that your team has adopted. Clearly, you have shown the saliency map and the ablation method as well. And now you guys have added the style GAN approach to provide further explainability of the AI performance. So I'm just wondering, moving ahead, what are your thoughts in terms of elucidating on the explainability of AI? Should we be doing all three, or would you envision that moving forward, it will be more of a style GAN approach? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the answer depends on what the goals are. And what kind of prediction you are pursuing. So some predictions, I think, fall under the category of tasks that a appropriately trained expert in the field can do if given the same image. So, for example, if you ask someone who's trained to then indicate whether the image has DR, has DME, hard exudates, like that kind of lesion that folks are trained to look for, given sufficient time, of course, sort of like ignoring any errors, you expect a pretty good performance. Now, if you have a model do the same thing, you should expect that the model is using probably the same kinds of features that the human is using, because that's the easiest kind of feature to use, because those features are already present in the image and the people are looking for that. So those should be easier to learn than other confounders. Now, it's not guaranteed that it may not be, it's sort of like not using any confounding aspects, but it's probably easier to find the same lesions. So in those cases, it's probably okay to just verify quickly that the model seems to be doing what you're expecting. But if you want to check carefully for any confounders, it's probably a good idea to try some of these generative techniques. One thing I should highlight though, when we use these generative techniques to do explainability, there is a possibility of having a false negative. What do I mean? So going back to the previous example when there's DR, so let's say that the model could be looking for heart exudates and cotton wool spots and other things. It is possible that the model will then highlight and pick out and generate these features. It's also possible that the generative model is not powerful enough to produce some of these features. And so you can have a false negative on the explainability side, not because the initial model was not using that feature, but because the generative model is not able to generate that. So that's a possibility. The other issue of these generative models is that they are actually pretty large. And they're large to the extent that if you were to think about comparing the original classification model versus the generative model, on average, you would expect that it's much harder and takes more data and longer to train the generative model compared to a classification model. So what that means is that if you have a pretty small data set on which you've trained the initial classification model, it's possible you don't quite have enough data to do that generative step as well. So I think there's a few caveats here. Generally speaking, I would encourage folks, if they're interested in explainability and debugging, to try things out. But on the debugging side in particular is where the false negative might have a bit of a problem, because it can be falsely reassuring that you don't see any confounders because it was not able to generate those confounding issues.
So a follow-up to that question, Yun, did you guys encounter any odd examples coming up from the generative model?
Odd examples. I think we showed some of the more interesting examples, both the reassuring ones and the eyeliner and such. There were a number of features that seemed to be not highly, but quite correlated with the model predictions, but that even with an expert eye, we couldn't really tell what the actual feature was changing. So I think that highlights maybe another sort of like aspect of these things where just because we are able to generate this sort of like animated version of the change, where theoretically that should make it pretty easy to pick out what is changing, it's sometimes changing in such a way that with the human eye and human knowledge, maybe we're not quite able to describe what it is that's happening over there, and therefore it's not a technique that gives you sort of like very, very complete, kind of like complete explainability. It just really helps you highlight a few more things.
Maybe I can have one more question before we move to the audience question. So in this generative model, this GAN-based model, I think the manipulation you just made on your animation depends on the fact that your learning can disentangle different features. So you can change one of the vectors or one real number in the vectors, and you can see the changes in the picture. So did you guys introduce like a specific disentanglement law into the function to like make this happen, or is naturally learned this way?
Yeah, so it for this particular technique, it turns out it naturally happens this way. I can talk a bit about how the model is trained. And so if you're familiar with GANs, this will not be surprising, but the way the model is trained is that there is the image is coming, sorry, 1 second. The way the model is trained is that the image is coming in to the encoder, and the thing that comes out, that's the embedding of the model, and the generator is generating an image. Now, in a classical GAN-based approach, what's happening is two things. One is reconstruction loss that's saying the image that you're inputting, an image is generating, should be basically as similar as possible. That's reconstruction loss. The classic GAN loss has a second component, which says that if you have a generated image, we should be this should be indistinguishable, and that's what the reconstruction loss is doing. But you have a second model that's trying to distinguish these generated ones from the input, the real images. the thing that we mentioned in terms of the style space and whether you happen to get this or some other property, it turns out that the way the style GAN architecture is actually set up, it tends to be the case that these elements tend to give you fairly visually coherent features. And so that's sort of like a property of this particular architecture. One modification that we made to this architecture actually is that the classification output of the original input image is actually being fed into this part and right before the affine layer, which means that that's something that's affecting the entire style space. And part of the reason we did this, I mean, there were empirical results that showed that it did better, but part of the reason is that we wanted to make sure that whatever the classification output or the category the image was, it actually is incorporated into the generative process, as opposed to being kind of like an artifact of that process. So this is making sure that this value over here, this information, this latent information, is actually embedded deeply in the generation process.
So the cross-entropy laws go all the way back into the style space as well. The gradient.
Yes.
Okay, thank
It
you.
actually goes all the way back into the encoder. So that's actually, yeah. The only thing that's frozen during the style GAN training process is the classifier.
Thank you.
Okay, we have several interesting questions on the chat box. Maybe we can start with some technical questions. So the first question is the example that you show us the eye linear, right? And that kind of imply the inherited bias, and the bias might affect the game and the model performance, and how to avoid such bias.
Yeah, so there's probably a few different ways in general to avoid this kind of bias. I think kind of like a prelude to that question though, sort of like answering a broader question is to first determine if what you're observing is a bias or if it's a kind of like a feature in the actual prediction. So what do I mean? So I'll get back to eyeliner in a moment. But for example, if you see something where it is looking at let's say age as a feature, right? And for certain things, age is actually a predictor as well and associated with the outcomes. Whether the model should be using age to do that prediction, I think is more of a philosophical question in terms of us needing to define whether that's the right thing to do at that stage in the pipeline, or if you want the model to output something that's completely independent of age. Now, for eyeliner specifically, this is probably a little bit more of a bias, and part of the reason for that is that this is something that is a completely modifiable factor. Meaning, if a person has eyeliner on, if they take it off and you take the photo again and the risk now has decreased, that's not a good thing. Because now you have this sort of like factor that you can just change, and it changes the prediction in a very counterintuitive way. So if a person was in a rush that day, didn't have makeup on, they will be put at lower or higher risk based on that factor. That's a little bit strange. There's some additional complication factor here, which is if you have eyeliner being a feature and we want to remove that, meaning we now have a model that works well when there's no eyeliner, you have to make sure that when you use the model, that everyone that's using the model now does not have such makeup on, which means you're also imposing constraints on how you're using the model. Now, getting back to the actual question, how do you remove such bias? There's two different ways. Some of it involves very simple sort of like sampling of the data set, such that you're weakening that association of eyeliner with the whatever prediction that you are interested in. Meaning you can sample it such that the presence of eyeliner is now no longer associated with whatever disease that you're looking at. That may or may not be possible depending on how deep the association goes, but that's one potential kind of like way to do that. Theoretically, if you have the ability to do kind of like prospective data collection at scale, you could also collect data where you explicitly ask people not to have eyeliner on, and then you can collect data that's sort of like more clean. Ideally, whenever you're thinking about the eventual deployment, the more that data set that you're collecting resembles the final deployment use case, the better it's going to be ideally. Another thing you can try and do in principle is to use a technique like this style GAN technique to break the correlation. And one way to do that is to say you can generate an image during training process, and now say that now I'm going to synthetically generate the version that doesn't have the eyeliner, and you're forcing the model to learn that this doesn't really matter. So you add another loss function to the classification model that says that you shouldn't be learning this particular feature. So that's another way to do it. That's probably one that's a bit brittle. I don't know if it's going to work well in general, but it can be worth trying.
Okay, great. So the second question is regarding the cornea reflections. And how did you check the quality of photo? And if there's more light reflection or the eye is a decentralized gaze, right? Does that affect the model's performance, and does that affect the prediction result?
That's a good question. I don't believe we had the ability to do that particular analysis at scale, so I don't think we did that. What we did do, though, is in some of the ablation-based analysis, so let me go back to that. When we're removing parts of the image, you're also removing the part that may have a reflection. So you can try and get some sense of what's happening with the reflections by essentially having that entire area removed. Now, of course, for some things, that's not going to be possible because, for example, for the cataract positive control experiment, once you remove the pupil area, that performance just crashes. So that becomes much less useful.
Okay, actually, the other question regarding the series image, right? The series image, right? I mean, iris photo improve the accuracy. And actually, I've also have a related question. I mean, how about the repeatabilities of the image? If you take, two images 5 minutes apart, right? Would you get the same result?
Yeah, so there's reproducibility and repeatability. I don't think we've tested it in this case because for the most part, all of the cases that we had, they had exactly 2 images, 1 per eye for that particular visit. So we didn't have the capability to test that. And in terms of serial images, so I'm going to assume sort of like if you have multiple photos over time, we did not actually have enough data to do a proper job to look at that. And so I think that's something that needs to be done in future work.
Okay, the other another question is very interesting, right? Are there any study looking at association of AI and for the anterior eye and iridologists? Iridology is based on the eye, iris pattern to predict whether you have any, systemic disease like liver disease or other, cancers and so on.
Yeah, this is starting to get close to that, huh? So I don't think we have done. We have definitely not done that. I think maybe the closest again to that is if we look at kind of like this ablation result, where we are looking at just having the iris around. So this is the solid blue line over here, and so you can kind of see that just having that, it's better than a baseline in some cases, but generally speaking, it's actually much worse than the overall model. So my takeaway from that is that the iris does not seem to be where the majority of the information is coming from. It does tend to be, for many cases, either outside of that or a little bit more diffuse, meaning the information is in many places.
Okay, so as you know, for the retinal photo, we start with cross-sectional prediction, right? And later on, people try to do that for longitudinal, disease instant or progression predictions. Is there any data set we can use this iris photo or the anterior segment photo for longitudinal prediction? And have you tried that?
Yeah, we didn't have enough data to do that. I think in the data sets that we were working with, we maybe only had a few hundred images where we had that kind of like longitudinal imaging. And once we isolated those to ones where we had the lab values for multiple visits, it quickly became intractable to do anything with that data. So it's something we're very interested in. We haven't had the data to be able to do that.
Okay, the other question, more practical question. I mean, this is also what I would like to know, right? Does Google have any plan to package your model, become an app, so we can download and take a photo by ourselves and do some predictions for health screening purpose?
Yeah, we don't currently have any plans to make this a product. I think the current plan is that this is a research project. We're trying to understand how well it works, how well it could work, and to explore different sort of like ways that this could potentially be useful, but all in the research space.
One of the audience also interested to know about the MPV because you show us only the PPV, but how about any range of MPV for different outcomes?
Yeah, I let me see if I have that slide. I may not have added it. The MPV, I believe, was much less interesting of a plot. No, I don't have it. So it's in a paper. It might be a extended data figure or a supplementary figure, but that's in a paper. If I go back to the PPV plot though, if I recall correctly, the MPV plot generally looks very high because a lot of the things we were looking at actually were had a bit of a class imbalance. So the negative predictive value tended to be much higher. And so there's a little bit more of a less of a difference between these different factors. The other thing that, another reason that we didn't emphasize the MPV results as much is because MPV, based on what it's measuring, is trying to say, can you rule out people? And we believe that with something that is, has AUCs in this kind of range, so let's say 70 range, to use such a kind of like a model to rule people out and say, hey, you're probably fine and you're unlikely to have whatever kind of like the thing that we're predicting over here, it feels a little bit potentially irresponsible to have that kind of certainty in a particular given the accuracy of this result. So we haven't. It's in a paper. It's not something that we are too focused on right now.
Maybe if I can follow up with a question on the NPV and PPV, Yun. What prevalences were you looking at? Were you looking just at the prevalence of the condition in your population, in the images that you were looking at, or were you just investigating on large, on a country prevalence or on a city prevalence for the PPV and
Yeah, so all of the data sets that we had, most of them were DR screening population. So it was a DR screening prevalence. Sorry, the prevalence of these things in the DR screening population. There was one that was more of a slightly more general, ophthalmic sort of care population, and so that one was not exclusively patients with diabetes, but they actually also had a number of patients with diabetes. In terms of the actual prevalence, we can see it from the counts over here. So for moderate plus DR, for example, this was about 10% prevalence in this particular population. DME was much lower. And then we can look at, let's say, this one ACR, that was also about 10%. So that it tended to be the case that we actually tended to have sort of like quite a severe class imbalance over here.
If I can just follow up quickly on that as well. In terms of, I think someone asked about the series of images, right? Now that your plan is to move to iPhones or iPhones or to just phones, right? Smartphones. I guess you can benefit as well from different fixation positions, right? Allowing the participant to move his eye, roll his eye around. Do you think that the algorithms will benefit from, maybe eccentric fixation to look more for hemoglobin, for example, to look more outside of the corneal region? Do you think this is a next step for what you're investigating?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had spoken with a number of people and sort of like planning kind of like follow-up studies to this. And one of the things that we were considering trying was to have, intuitively to have the patient sort of like hold down the eyelid or clinician hold down the eyelid and to look more at sort of like the peripheral sort of like areas. Right now, we're not prioritizing doing that kind of exploration for two reasons. One, if we think about kind of like making this as user-friendly as possible for a general lay person, then the easier the photography is, the better, the easier it is for them to do that. And then the other thing was that all of the data sets that we have trained the model on was in a case where there was no such manipulation or fixation or gaze or anything being done. And I think for the most part, everyone was staring sort of like straight at the camera. And so if we think about how do we get a model to do this well, we're likely going to do better when it is more similar to that particular setup in terms of training data that we have.
Okay, in order that the image taken by different camera are very different from each other, right? In this case, basically, your iris photo and your second photo were taken by the fundus camera. But you want to apply this in the, let's say, iPhone or other smartphone, right? I mean, to my knowledge, the smartphone or iPhone have more, image processing, right, inside the phone. So in your experience, does that affect the model's performance, and how should we overcome these problems?
Yeah, I will be lying if I were to say that that I have a perfect idea of how that would change things. I think the short answer is that we have not we don't have peer-reviewed data that describes what will happen if you have photos taken from a very different source, that where the sensor is different, the post-processing and image processing is different. So I think the short answer is it's kind of hard to tell. In principle, though, to some extent, there's going to be image processing that's happening on device also for the fundus camera, and when we ingest the images and so forth, as well as when we are training these models, we're applying perturbations to the models. And so if I were to guess, there might be some performance degradation if we use directly that model trained on fundus cameras and directly applied that. But if we have sufficient data, it should be probably pretty feasible to fine-tune the model that was trained on fundus on the smartphone images. So my guess, my bets will be on, if there's any performance degradation, it'll be pretty minor. And if there are, we should be able to fine-tune the model slightly, such that it works pretty reasonably.
Yun, perhaps I can follow up with the next question, actually a little bit pertaining to this smartphone question as well. So I know in your paper, you guys didn't quite get to use the smartphone, but you demonstrated with different image resolution and indirectly indicate that potentially it's possible. So assuming that smartphone part is indeed possible, that's out of the way. When it comes to actual deployment, I'm just wondering, how do you plan to prove the value? Because earlier in your slide, you mentioned that despite the AUC being maybe in the range of 60-70+%, the angle of this is to do triaging and to flag up people who potentially need further examinations. So how do you plan to prove the value in this regard? Do you plan to do it in a community setting or in a clinical setting? I'd like to hear your views on this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have the answer to that right now. What we are trying to do right now is, as we do these studies, we submit it for peer review, and just to really generate discussion in the community to really understand, hey, here are where we think, on the research side, where the capabilities are right now. Let's assume it can be maybe a bit better if we have deliberately collected data for this. But given the current performance characteristics of the model, what looks like it's something that may be useful for different settings. So it's something that we're sort of like keeping an eye and a ear out for people to really be talking about and to understand what people might want to use it for. From our perspective, just kind of like from a very naive angle, the fact that you have a particular sensitivity and specificity, you can mathematically compute what the odds ratio would be if you apply it in specific settings with some assumed prevalence of disease, and so that's something we can do. But then linking up with what makes sense in terms of a sequence of tests and ruling in or ruling out patients, I think that's kind of a further step that really needs to be done in the context of a particular kind of practice or setting, where you really know what it is that the barriers to care are for that particular population.
Thank you. And the reason why I raised this is because I'm just thinking out loud, assuming that this now can be used on smartphone, and a lot of public members, they will start using smartphone to take their own external eye photos. So chances are that there might be some false positive cases, and it may end up inadvertently encouraging people to go for further examinations where they don't really need. So that's just one of the risk of it. But anyway, it's just a comment, and I noted that further evaluations are needed in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Completely agreed. Sort of like stimulating kind of like unnecessary utilization of care is definitely a concern in general whenever you think about some of these things. In principle, there are some potential ways to use technology like this that doesn't involve the direct patient care, where the patient is not able to see that output, and so you can incorporate that separately in kind of like a more customized way, right? But exactly how one would operationalize that, I think that's really dependent on the healthcare system, resourcing, and what the goals of the system look like.
We also have a new question on also the technical questions. Did you adjust the picture exposure brightness to a similar level? And do you think this has an impact?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is that we didn't do that in this particular work. And one thing we were a bit surprised about was that different data sets actually had a little bit of a different protocol in terms of how they were taking the photos. So things were a little bit different in terms of the protocol. One thing that was very different though is that two of the data sets that we were working with, they had a bit of a greenish tint to the images. And so that was surprising to us. It turns out that that didn't seem to have affected the model's performance. But in retrospect, we probably would have wanted to actually to improve that by kind of like having some kind of normalization process that maybe does a deliberate color calibration process to change the colors to all the same thing. So short answer is we didn't do that. In retrospect, maybe we should have, but it did turn out there were some differences that didn't affect performance.
Okay. So actually, just now there's another question regarding the Google's or the verifies. They have a new camera, right? We are all curious about Google's plan. So what's Google's plan for this new portable camera? I mean, to my understanding, I think the priority is still the screening for diabetic retinopathy, right? But is there any plan to do any other, disease screenings?
Yeah, so I think for context, we're in Google Research. The camera is being made by Verily, so that's a sister company, which means they have kind of like different goals in terms of their team. That camera right now, I believe, does not actually do automated diagnosis. What it does is that it helps people take higher quality photos with a smaller device and a better user interface and such. There are also some capabilities such as getting higher quality images by using some computer vision techniques and so forth, but doesn't actually do the AI portion of it. So actually it's not doing DR, which means that it's also not extending capabilities beyond DR either.
Any other comment from the panelists?
Yeah, I just have a naive question. I'm just wondering, the Verily's retinal camera, is that available for Asia market now?
I believe it's being cleared for the US market right now. I'm not sure specifically about plans for Asia or any other jurisdictions right now, but if you send me an email, I can put you in touch with the team and we can figure out what makes sense.
Sure, would love to. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm seeing another question on my end, so I guess I can briefly summarize and I can talk through it. The question says that age or ARCUS and A1C correlation is not usually expected, and A1C is more likely to be correlated with the duration of diabetes. And so how to avoid these associations? Yeah, I think generally agree. In our datasets, it tends to be that we have a bit of a correlation between the duration of diabetes and age as well. It's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but there's a bit of an association. And so how to avoid these associations? I think this is a really tough question. There are ways where during training, you can try and do adversarial losses and such to try and remove that. And so this is a bit different than the eyeliner case because eyeliner was sort of like something that was embedded directly in an image that's modifiable. So you can collect new data that changes the association. Here, if there is association, it is what it is in a data set. If you collect more, you're going to see essentially the same kind of pattern still. So you can't collect more data or targeted data or modified data collection protocols to modify that. And so what you could do in this case is to try and see if you can remove it via the training process, or try and see if there's any other things that you can modify such that, so for example, figure out where that signal tends to be coming from in certain cases and see if there's a way that you can mask out that portion such that you remove that signal. One thing that you need to be a bit careful when you do that is to make sure that you're masking out both where the location that seems to be predicted for that, but you have to try and do this more systematically across all images in some semi-random way, such that the presence of the masking is not going to end up becoming indicative that the feature was there. So what's one example? If there's a spot or a laterality marker in this image, we think that's going to be correlated with the output, so we mask that out. Now, some images don't have that marker, so we're not masking out. So what the model can then learn is, instead of learning that the marker is indication of whatever prediction, it learns that the fact that you have this black box that you added is a marker. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're removing some of these associations. Again, there's a bit of a philosophical view where if there's a correlation of age or duration of diabetes, and the model can predict some of these variables, what should the model be doing? Do you want the model to be learning that or not? I think that's a little bit of a philosophical question. I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Any more common question from our panelists?
So Yun, going back to the explainability part, I'm just wondering, did you guys observe any related features pertaining to eyelids? Because with age, for example, the eyelids tend to drop a little bit with droopy eyelids, for example. So did you guys observe any potential association that comes with the eyelid, even though it's covering the iris or even the pupil a little bit? But was those kind of features associated with some outcomes?
So I think the short answer is no, and I'll describe why. I can see this being something the model could learn in the right population. I believe for the most part, the DR screening populations that we had an average age where you weren't quite getting to that elderly of a population where you see a lot more of the drooping. So I believe that might be part of why we did not see that. Again, though, I think with these generative techniques, one potential possibility is the false negative issue, meaning if we see something, we have some level of confidence that this was associated with the prediction. If we don't see it, we don't have a ton of confidence that we don't see it because that association was absent or that the model didn't use it. It's quite possible that the generator was not able to generate that particular kind of change.
Okay, great. I think time is almost up. I want to thank Yun for your wonderful talk. And this is our last seminar we have in 2023. And please stay tuned for our webinar series in 2024. Thank you all for joining us today. I wish you all have a happy holiday season in December. Thank you all. Bye. Have a good night.